The executioner raises his axe. The blade falls. Karen's right foot separates from her ankle in a spray of blood and bone. Before the girl can scream, the foot stands up. Still wearing its red patent leather shoe, it begins to dance. The executioner positions her left leg. The blade falls again. Now both feet are severed, both still encased in gleaming red shoes, and they dance away from her bleeding body, spinning and twirling across the yard, disappearing into the forest where she can never follow. This is not a fairy tale. This is a medical procedure. In 1845, Hans Christian Andersen published a story about a girl whose feet had to be amputated because she wanted to dance. What he was really writing about was how Victorian society dealt with girls who refused to stay still. If you're here seeking what they buried, the truths they locked in fairy tales and told children not to question, you've found the right archive. Subscribe to the Pandora's Project. We're opening the sealed boxes together, one truth at a time. And before this is over, you'll see why the real horror isn't the dancing feet. It's what made amputation look like mercy. Part 1. The Transaction. In a village in Denmark, sometime in the early 1800s, there lived a girl named Karen. She was poor. Not just poor, but destitute. The kind of poor where you have no shoes at all. In summer, Karen walked barefoot. Her feet got cut on stones, burned on hot ground, covered in blisters and dirt. In winter, she wore heavy wooden clogs that scraped her ankles raw until they bled. This was her life. Cold, hungry, shoeless. She owned nothing pretty, nothing fine. Just rough clothes, wooden clogs, and the constant ache of poverty pressing down on her. Then, her mother died. Karen had been the only family her mother had. Now Karen was truly alone. A child orphan in a world that did not care about orphans. She would probably end up begging in the streets or working herself to death in someone's kitchen or dying young of disease like so many poor children did. But an old woman in the village took pity on Karen. This woman knew how to sew. She took scraps of red cloth, old worn fabric that someone had thrown away, and she stitched together a crude pair of shoes for Karen. They were not much. They were roughly made, uneven, clearly the work of an amateur. But they were red, bright red. The first pretty thing Karen had ever owned in her entire life. Karen wore these red shoes to her mother's funeral. This was improper. Funerals required black. Mourning required somber, dark colors. But Karen had no other shoes except her wooden clogs, and she could not wear clogs to her own mother's funeral. So she wore the red shoes. If anyone noticed or disapproved, the story does not say. At the funeral, a wealthy old lady was in attendance. She saw Karen standing alone at her mother's grave in her threadbare dress and crude red shoes. The old lady's heart was moved. That poor child, she thought. She has no one, no family, no prospects. She will end up in the workhouse or worse. So the old lady made a decision. She would adopt Karen, take her into her home, give her education and refinement. Turn this poor orphan into a respectable young lady. Karen could barely believe her fortune. One day, she was an orphan with nothing. The next, she was living in a fine house with good food, a warm bed, and a benefactor who wanted to give her a better life. But here is what the story does not say plainly. The old lady did not adopt Karen out of pure charity. In 19th century Denmark, poor girls were economic assets. They could not legally refuse work. They had no wages to negotiate. They had no family to protect them. The old lady got years of unpaid domestic labor. She got social status as a charitable benefactor. She got a servant who would never leave, never complain, never ask for anything because gratitude was the only currency Karen had. Karen was not saved. She was purchased. The old lady took one look at Karen's red shoes and said, "Those are completely unsuitable, inappropriate, improper." And she burned them. She threw the red shoes into the fire and watched them curl and blacken and turn to ash. Then she dressed Karen in proper black mourning clothes and gave her sensible dark shoes. "This is how a respectable young lady dresses," she said. Karen watched her beautiful red shoes burn. The first pretty thing she had ever owned, gone. But she said nothing. She was grateful for her new life. She would be obedient. She would be good. And for years she was. Years passed. The old lady taught Karen to read, to write, to behave. Karen learned gratitude first, obedience second. What she was really learning was how to disappear, how to make her poverty invisible, how to erase the barefoot girl she had been, how to speak correctly, sit correctly, dress correctly, how to become acceptable. By 15, the old lady owned her completely, not through law or contract, through debt, the debt of rescue, the debt of improvement, the debt that could never be repaid because it grew with every meal, every lesson, every correction. People began to notice that Karen was pretty. She had dark hair and bright eyes. When she walked through town, people would turn to look at her. They would say, "What a lovely girl. How fortunate she is to have been adopted by that kind old lady." Karen would go home and look in the mirror. The mirror told her what people said. She was pretty, beautiful even. And Karen began to care very much about being pretty. The story tells us this was the beginning of her corruption. The sin of vanity was taking root in her heart. That debt was about to come due at a ceremony where Karen would be inspected, judged, and marked. And she was about to make a choice that would cost her the only thing she still owned, her feet. Part 2. The Inspection. At 15, it was time for Karen's confirmation. In the Lutheran Church, confirmation marked a child's transition into Christian adulthood. It was one of the most important moments in a young person's life. A sacred, solemn occasion. But confirmation was not just spiritual. It was economic. Without a confirmation certificate, a girl could not work legally. She could not marry in the church. She could not access charity or poor relief. Confirmation was a gatekeeper. On one side, desperation. On the other, survival. And to pass through that gate, you had to be inspected. At 15, confirmation meant one thing to Karen. She would stand before the church and be examined. Not her soul, her body, her clothes, her shoes. Everything would be seen and marked, appropriate or inappropriate, safe or dangerous. And on that judgment depended whether anyone would hire her, marry her, or feed her. For confirmation, Karen needed new shoes. Her old ones were worn out. The old lady, whose eyesight was failing, sent Karen to the shoemaker with her guardian to choose appropriate confirmation shoes. But before we talk about what those shoes meant, you need to know about Strasbourg, 1518. 400 people danced themselves to death in the streets. Most were women. Karen was about to join them. They went into town to the shop, and in the shop window, Karen saw them. A pair of red patent leather shoes. They were beautiful. They gleamed and shone like jewels. The leather was polished to a mirror shine, reflecting light like water. They were elegant, refined, expensive. They looked exactly like the shoes Karen had once seen on the feet of a princess who had passed through the village in a grand carriage. Karen could not look away from them. "Those are made of patent leather," the shoemaker said, noticing her gaze. "They shine beautifully, do they not?" "Yes," Karen whispered. "They shine." Patent leather shines. It reflects. And in the eyes of the church, a woman who wears something that reflects, that gleams, that calls attention to her body, She is making an announcement about her intentions. Patent leather was not just vain, it was sexually transgressive. The shine could theoretically show what was beneath a woman's skirt. Wearing patent leather was a coded accusation. It said she wanted to be looked at. It said her body was available for inspection. The shoemaker knew what he was selling. Karen knew what she was choosing. The old lady squinted at the shoes. Her eyesight was poor. In the dim light of the shop with her failing vision, the shoes looked dark to her. "Are those black?" she asked. The shoemaker glanced at Karen. Karen said nothing. "They will do nicely for confirmation," the old lady said, mishearing the silence as confirmation. She agreed to purchase them. Karen walked out of that shop wearing red patent leather shoes. And she knew she had deceived her guardian. She knew the old lady thought the shoes were black. She knew red was inappropriate for church, for confirmation, for a solemn religious ceremony. But she said nothing. She wanted those shoes more than she wanted to be honest. Confirmation day arrived. Karen dressed carefully in her white confirmation gown. On her feet, gleaming and bright, were the red shoes. She walked to church. Every step, she looked down at her feet, at the beautiful shoes that shone in the sunlight. She felt special, important, seen. Inside the church, people stared, not at her face, not at her white gown, but at her feet, at those bright red reflective shoes, completely inappropriate for the occasion. Some people whispered, some frowned, but Karen barely noticed. She was too entranced by her own shoes. The ceremony began. Karen walked to the altar to take her vows, to accept the bread and wine, to confirm her faith before God. This was supposed to be the most important spiritual moment of her life. She should have been thinking about God, about salvation, about her immortal soul. But all Karen could think about was her shoes. She looked down at them, admired how they shone against the dark church floor, thought about how pretty they looked, how elegant she must appear. Even at the altar, even as the minister spoke the holy words, Karen's mind was on her shoes. She barely heard the ceremony. She was lost in vanity, in pride, in the pleasure of having something beautiful. After the service, the old lady saw Karen's shoes clearly for the first time in full daylight. She was furious. "Those shoes are red. You told me they were black. Red shoes are completely inappropriate for church. How could you deceive me?" Karen stammered an excuse, but the old lady cut her off. "You will never wear those shoes to church again. Do you understand? Never. Always wear black shoes to church. Red is improper, immodest, unsuitable." Karen nodded, ashamed. "Yes, ma'am. I understand." But inside she was thinking about how beautiful the shoes were, how wonderful it felt to wear them, how people had noticed her. The next Sunday came. Karen looked at her closet, at the sensible black shoes the old lady expected her to wear, and at the red patent leather shoes gleaming on the shelf. She chose the red shoes. She told herself it would be fine, that no one would really mind, that they were just shoes after all. What harm could they do? She put them on and walked to church. At the church door, there stood an old soldier. He was a fixture of the town, a beggar who leaned on a crutch and asked for alms from churchgoers. He had a strange, unkempt red beard and a peculiar way of looking at people, as if he saw things others could not. Most Sundays, Karen walked past him without a second glance. But this Sunday, he saw her shoes. His eyes gleamed. He smiled a strange smile. "What beautiful dancing shoes," he said, his voice carrying an odd resonance, as if his words meant more than they seemed. The old soldier bent low on his crutch. He tapped her shoes once, twice. "Sit fast when you dance," he said. It was not advice. It was what every man in that church had already told her in 100 small ways. Girls who dance are girls who lose control. Girls who dance cannot be trusted. Girls who dance will be stopped. The old soldier was not a mysterious curse giver. He was every male authority figure. Every soldier, every priest, every father, every magistrate. His tap on the shoe was every threat ever made to girls who step out of line. The old soldier's curse was planted, and in less than an hour, Karen's feet would start moving on their own, and they would not stop for 6 days. Part 3. The Body Speaks. After the service, Karen walked toward the old lady's carriage. But as she approached it, something strange happened. Her feet began to move. Just a little at first. A small step to the side. A tiny shuffle. But then another step and another. Her feet were moving of their own accord. Karen tried to stop. She tried to stand still, but her feet would not obey. They moved in rhythm, as if hearing music she could not hear. They danced. She danced away from the carriage, across the churchyard, past the gravestones, toward the street. Her feet moved faster and faster, spinning her in circles, pulling her along. "Karen," the old lady called. "Karen, stop this instant." But Karen could not stop. The coachman had to run after her, grab her bodily, and physically carry her back to the carriage. Even then, her feet kept kicking, kept moving, trying to dance. They got her into the carriage and removed the shoes. Her feet finally stilled. The old lady was horrified. "What possessed you? What was that display?" Karen had no answer. She did not understand it herself, but she felt shaken, frightened. What had just happened? The red shoes were locked away in a cabinet when they got home. The old lady took the key and hid it. "You will not wear those shoes again," she said firmly. "Ever." Karen nodded. She was ashamed. Whatever had happened in the churchyard had scared her. She promised herself she would never wear the red shoes again. But even as she made that promise, she could still feel them on her feet. Could still remember how they had moved, how they danced. And deep down, she wanted to feel it again. Weeks passed. Karen wore her sensible black shoes. She went to church. She did her chores. She was obedient. The red shoes stayed locked in the cabinet. Then one day, the old lady fell ill. It came on suddenly. A fever. A weakness in her limbs. The doctor was called. He examined her and shook his head gravely. "She is very ill. She needs constant care. Rest. Fluids. Nursing." The old lady took to her bed. It was Karen's duty to care for her. This woman had saved her from poverty, had given her a home, had raised her. Now, in her hour of need, Karen would repay that kindness. Karen sat by the old lady's bedside, brought her water, adjusted her pillows, read to her from the Bible. The old lady grew weaker day by day. It became clear she was dying. "You are a good girl, Karen," the old lady whispered one evening, her voice thin and weak. "You have been like a daughter to me." Karen held her hand and said the right things. But inside she felt restless, trapped. She was young. She wanted to live, to experience things, to see the world beyond this sick room. And then she heard the news. There was to be a grand ball in town. The most important families would be there. Music, dancing, fine clothes, young men and women dressed in their best, spinning across a polished floor. It would be the event of the season. Everyone Karen knew was talking about it. Everyone was going. Everyone except Karen, who was trapped in this house, watching an old woman die. Karen looked at the old lady, asleep in her bed, her breathing shallow and labored. She looked at the locked cabinet where the red shoes were hidden. She knew where the key was. She had watched the old lady put it in a drawer. She should not. She knew she should not. But the pull was irresistible. "She is sleeping," Karen told herself. She will not even know I am gone. I will just go for a few hours. I will be back before she wakes. What harm could it do? It is just one evening, just one ball. Karen retrieved the key, opened the cabinet. There they were, the red patent leather shoes, gleaming as brightly as ever. She picked them up. They felt warm in her hands, as if they were alive. She put them on. They fit perfectly. They had always fit perfectly. Karen left the house, leaving the dying old lady alone, and went to the ball. The ball was everything Karen had imagined. A grand hall lit by hundreds of candles. Musicians playing beautiful music. Young people in their finest clothes laughing and dancing. Karen entered and people noticed her. Noticed her shoes. Noticed her beauty. Noticed the graceful way she moved. Young men asked her to dance. And Karen danced. At first, it was wonderful, magical, perfect. The red shoes seemed to move on their own, guiding her steps, making her more graceful than she had ever been. She was the best dancer in the room. Everyone was watching her. Karen had never felt so alive, so free, so seen. She danced one song, then another, then another. The music was intoxicating. The movement was intoxicating. She never wanted it to end. But then something changed. The music ended. The dance was over. People were taking breaks, getting refreshments, resting. Karen tried to stop dancing. She could not. Her feet kept moving. Even though the music had stopped, even though there was no rhythm to follow, her feet continued to dance. Panic rose in her chest. "Stop!" she whispered to her feet. "Please stop." They did not stop. She tried to remove the shoes. She bent down, grabbed at them, tried to pull them off, but they would not budge. They were stuck to her feet as if they were part of her skin, as if they had grown onto her. Karen danced out of the ballroom. People moved aside, confused and alarmed. She danced down the hallway, out the front door, into the street. And she kept dancing. Karen danced through the town streets, past shops and houses, through alleys and squares. People stopped to stare at her. Some laughed. Some pointed. Some looked frightened. "Help me," she cried. "Please help me stop." But no one could help her. When people tried to grab her, to hold her still, her feet were too quick. She danced away from them. The shoes were in control now, not her. She danced out of town, into the countryside. Her feet carried her down dirt roads, through fields, toward the forest. She had no choice in where she went. The shoes decided. Night fell. Karen danced in the darkness, stumbling over roots and stones. She could not see where she was going. She tripped and fell. But even on the ground, her feet kept moving, kept trying to dance. She stood up, and the dance continued. She danced through the entire night. By dawn, her legs were cramping. Her feet were blistering inside the shoes. She was exhausted, hungry, thirsty. But the shoes did not care. They danced on. Stop. Before we continue Karen's story, you need to understand something. This is not fiction. This is medical history. In 1518, in Strasbourg, a city in what is now France, a woman named Frau Trophea began dancing in the street. She danced for 6 days straight. By day 3, her shoes had worn through. By day 5, she was dancing on bloody stumps. The town hired musicians, thinking if she danced enough, the curse would exhaust itself. It did not. More women joined her. Within a month, 400 people were dancing uncontrollably in the streets of Strasbourg. They danced until they collapsed. Some died of heart attacks, strokes, exhaustion. The authorities tried to cure them by providing more music and more dancers, which only made it worse. The dancing plague lasted for months. Similar epidemics occurred throughout medieval Europe. No one knows exactly what caused these events. Theories include mass hysteria, ergot poisoning from fungus on grain, religious ecstasy, social contagion during times of stress like plague and famine. But look at who was dancing. Mostly women. Women in cities starving. Women terrified of plague. Women living under absolute male control. Their bodies spoke what their voices could not. Karen is not fiction. She is a diagnosis, and her body was about to speak what her voice could not, for 6 days straight, until there was nothing left but bone and blood and guilt. Karen danced for days. She danced past her home. She could see the house where the old lady lay dying. Karen tried to turn toward it, tried to make her feet carry her to the door, but the shoes danced her past it. She called out, but no one heard her. Or if they did, they didn't come out. She wondered if the old lady was dead yet. If she died alone while Karen was at the ball. While Karen was dancing in her cursed red shoes. The guilt was almost worse than the physical pain. Almost. She danced into the forest. Branches caught at her clothes, tearing them. Thorns scratched her face and arms, drawing blood. But the shoes danced on, pulling her deeper into the woods. The old lady was already dead. Had been for 3 days. Karen would never make it to the funeral, but she would make it to the church. And what waited there was not forgiveness. It was judgment delivered by an angel with a flaming sword. Part 4. The medical cure. Days blurred together. Karen lost track of time. She could not sleep. The shoes never stopped long enough. She could not eat or drink. Every time she tried to stop at a stream or reach for berries, the shoes danced her away. She was dying. Slowly, painfully, she was dying on her feet. In her delirium, Karen danced back toward the town, toward the church. Maybe God could help her. Maybe if she could reach the church, if she could pray, if she could beg for forgiveness, the curse would end. She danced up the path to the church. The building rose before her, white stone and tall spire, the door open and welcoming. Karen danced toward the door. Just a few more steps. Just reach the threshold. Just get inside. Karen reached the church steps. But you need to understand something about churches in 1845 Denmark. They were not places of mercy for wayward girls. They were places of judgment. As she approached, a figure appeared in the doorway. An angel. Not a gentle angel. Not the kind with soft wings and a benevolent smile. This was an angel of judgment. Tall and terrible, dressed in white robes that seemed to glow with harsh light. In his hand, he held a great sword, and the blade burned with flames. He stepped forward, blocking her path. Karen tried to dance past him, but he moved to bar her way. "Please," she gasped. "Please, I need to get inside. I need help. I need forgiveness." "No," the angel said. His voice was like thunder, like the grinding of stones. "You cannot enter here, but I need to pray. I need forgiveness." The angel raised his flaming sword. "You chose vanity over duty. You chose pleasure over righteousness. You chose dancing over devotion. I am sorry. Please, I'm sorry." "Sorry is not enough," the angel said. And then he spoke her doom, and his words seemed to echo from the sky itself. "You shall dance in your red shoes until you are pale and cold, until your skin shrivels on your bones and you are a skeleton rattling in the shoes. You shall dance from door to door, through streets and fields. And wherever proud, vain children live, you shall knock so they hear you and fear you. You shall dance as you danced in the church where you should have been thinking only of God. Dance. You shall dance. Dance in your red shoes." The air seemed to vibrate with the weight of the curse. This was not just the shoes anymore. This was divine punishment. This was God's judgment delivered by male religious authorities' final verdict. This was not divine punishment anymore. This was something else. Something Karen would soon beg an executioner to help her with. The angel pointed his sword at Karen. Go, and let your suffering be a lesson to others. Karen tried to speak, but no words came. The shoes spun her around and danced her away from the church, away from salvation, away from mercy. She danced through landscapes she did not recognize, through dark forests where wolves howled, through bogs where the ground sucked at her feet but could not hold the shoes, through rocky hills that tore what remained of her clothes and skin. She was a horror to look at now. Her dress was in rags. Her arms and legs were covered in scratches and cuts. Her face was gaunt, her lips cracked and bleeding. Sometimes she passed near villages. People would see her, this wild, ragged thing dancing like a mad woman, and they would make signs against evil. Mothers would pull their children inside and bar the doors. The dancing girl, they whispered. The cursed one. That is what happens to vain children. To children who care more about pretty things than about God. She is a warning. Remember her and be good. And then, in a moment of clarity through the fog of exhaustion and starvation, Karen understood something. There was only one way this would end. The shoes would never come off. The curse would never lift. She would dance until she died, and then her corpse would dance on, a horrible puppet worked by cursed shoes. Unless she removed the feet. Karen understood there was only one solution. The same solution Victorian doctors prescribed for thousands of women whose bodies would not obey. Remove the part that is refusing to submit. If she had no feet, the shoes would have nothing to control. She would be free. Crippled, ruined, but free. Karen danced her way to the edge of town, to a small house on the outskirts that everyone knew. A house people tried not to look at when they passed. The executioner's house. Karen's feet danced her to the executioner's door. She pounded on it with her fists, the only part of her body she still controlled. The door opened. A large man stood there, bearded and grim. He looked at her, at this wretched dancing creature on his doorstep, and his face showed both horror and pity. Please, Karen managed to gasp. Please help me. How? He asked. I cannot stop you dancing. I can see that you are cursed. Cut off my feet, Karen said. The executioner stared at her. What? Cut off my feet. It is the only way. Please, I am begging you. The executioner's axe was sharper than the surgeon's knives, but the logic was the same. A woman's body is dangerous when she will not obey. Remove the dangerous part. Dr. Isaac Baker Brown, president of the Medical Society of London, prescribed clitoridectomy for women diagnosed with unnatural irritability. His textbook was standard medical training until 1867. In Victorian medical practice, amputation was prescribed for female hysteria and waywardness. Doctors performed clitoridectomy, hysterectomy, limb amputation to cure women deemed uncontrollable. The executioner was simply performing what respectable physicians were doing in hospitals across Europe. Are you certain? He asked quietly. Yes. Please. Do it now before I lose my courage. The executioner nodded. He went inside and returned with his axe, the same axe he used for executions. Heavy, sharp, freshly honed. Sit on the step, he said. Or try to hold still as much as you can. Karen tried. Her feet kept moving, kept trying to dance, but she gripped the doorframe and forced herself to hold as still as possible. The executioner knelt. He positioned her right leg. He raised the axe. Look away, he said gently. Karen looked away. She closed her eyes. The axe fell. There was a moment of impact, of shock, of pressure, and then agony. Pure, white-hot, consuming agony. Karen screamed. She had never felt pain like this. It was as if her entire leg was on fire, as if something vital had been torn from her body, which it had. But through the pain, through the horror, she felt something else. Her right foot had stopped moving. The executioner worked quickly. He positioned her left leg, raised the axe again. "I'm sorry," he said. The axe fell a second time. More agony. Karen screamed again, her voice raw and broken. Blood poured from the stumps of her ankles, pooling on the ground. But both feet had stopped moving. And then, before Karen's disbelieving eyes, her feet, still encased in the red shoes, stood up. They stood on the ground in front of her. Two severed feet, ankle bones white and bloody, red shoes still perfectly in place. And they danced. They danced away from her, across the yard toward the road. They spun and twirled and leapt as graceful as ever, as if they did not need legs or a body to work them. Karen watched them go. Watched her own feet, separated from her body, dancing into the distance, dancing toward the forest where she could never follow. They disappeared into the trees, and she never saw them again. The feet were gone. The curse should have ended. But for women like Karen, punishment does not end. It just changes form. And what happened next proved that cutting off her feet was only the beginning of her exile. Part 5. Permanent exile. The executioner saved Karen's life. He carved wooden feet for her stumps. She became a servant at the parsonage, the hardest work, the worst tasks. And every Sunday, while everyone went to church, Karen stayed home and prayed alone. She prayed for weeks. Then she decided she had to try to enter the church. She hobbled down the road on her wooden feet, made it halfway to the church. And then she saw them. Her severed feet, still wearing the red shoes, dancing on the church steps, spinning in circles, blocking the door. She turned back. 3 months passed. She tried again. This time the feet were waiting at the end of her road, dancing around her in circles until she was dizzy and weeping. She crawled back. 6 months. She woke before dawn, hoping to avoid them. She made it to the church door, put her hand on the handle, and felt them. Her own severed feet, dancing on top of her wooden stumps, pinning her in place. She could not move forward. She could not go inside. She would never go inside. The curse had not ended when the executioner's axe fell. It had learned patience. Every Sunday, every church, every attempt at redemption, blocked. She was permanently exiled. Not by God, but by a system that demanded her punishment be eternal. By 1846, Victorian asylums held 3 times more women than men. Diagnoses included reading too much, arguing with husbands, refusing orders. Karen was luckier than those women. At least she got to choose how her story ended. She was dying, slowly, working herself to exhaustion, eating less and less. Her body was giving up. On a Sunday morning, alone in her room, she whispered, "Please, I gave you my feet. What more do you want?" The room filled with light. The angel returned, not with a sword this time, but with a rose branch in bloom. He touched the ceiling and it vanished. Karen heard church music, the music she had been barred from for months. "Go in peace," he said. She felt herself rising. Her body stayed on the floor, thin and broken and finally still. But something else rose toward the music, toward the open sky, toward what might be heaven. The story shows her rising. It shows the music. It shows heaven opening above her. But notice what it does not say. It does not say the doors opened. It does not say God welcomed her. It does not say Karen made it inside. Because for women like Karen, and for Hans Christian Andersen himself, forgiveness was always conditional, always just out of reach. The dance of seeking redemption never ends. Part 6. Transmitting the Wound. Hans Christian Andersen wrote Karen's story in 1845. He was 40 years old, and he had been carrying her curse his entire life. Born in Odense, Denmark, in 1805, Hans grew up in desperate poverty. His father was a shoemaker who died when Hans was 11. Young Hans was mocked relentlessly, called ugly, strange, different. But he had imagination, and he had ambition, the kind poor children are not supposed to have. At 14, his mother scraped together money for his confirmation shoes. They were red, the only shoes they could afford. Hans wore them to church. The other children laughed. The adults frowned. That day, Hans learned that wanting beauty when you are poor is a sin. 40 years later, he sat down and turned that shame into Karen, a girl whose crime was wanting to be seen, a girl punished with eternal exile for the sin of desiring beauty. He gave her the cruelest fate he could imagine: amputation, servitude, and an ambiguous salvation that might not be salvation at all. He did not write this to warn children. He wrote it to transmit his wound, to ensure generations would feel what he felt. That desire is dangerous, that beauty is a curse, that wanting anything will cost you everything. Victorian society used fairy tales as instruments of social control. Stories that taught children, especially girls, that their bodies were dangerous, their desires were sins, their ambitions were curses. Andersen gave them the perfect weapon, and it worked. The Red Shoes was published across Europe. It was taught in schools, read at bedtimes, used by parents and priests and teachers to terrify children into obedience. Karen's dancing feet became a warning whispered to every girl who wanted too much, who stood too tall, who refused to disappear. Final part. The breaking seals. Karen's severed feet are still dancing somewhere in that forest outside Odense, still wearing those red patent leather shoes, still spinning, still waiting. The curse did not end in 1845. It spread into Victorian asylums where women were locked away for wanting, into 20th century schools where girls learned their bodies were dangerous, into 21st century bedrooms where girls still cut away parts of themselves trying to become acceptable. Better to stay still. Better to be invisible. Better to have no feet than to dance. The question is not whether we still tell this story. We do. Every time we punish women for taking up space, every time we demand someone shrink, silence, disappear, every time we call ambition unfeminine and desire dangerous, the question is, whose feet are we still cutting off to keep them from dancing? If this story revealed something you needed to see, leave a comment. Tell me what Karen's curse showed you about the world we are living in. And if you are ready to keep seeking these buried truths with me, subscribe to the Pandora's Project. The seals are breaking. The archives are opening. And there are more stories waiting to be unearthed. See you in the next tomb.